Hello?
Yes, Mark, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So anyway, so great location for these guys. Less than one day's drive. In some cases, half a day's drive. Next slide, please.
Sure.
Sure. So I don't want to. A lot of information here. All this slide is to demonstrate is that there's a ton of stuff going on in Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Manufacturing from the auto industry to the tier one to the tier two, tier three auto suppliers, from appliance companies to HVAC companies to electronics companies. All the world brand names you'll recognize are manufacturing in one or two or three of these four countries and supplying to Western Europe in a big way. Next slide, please.
Sure.
Yeah, just to kind of give you an idea, very stable markets last 5 years. You can see inflation rates have gone up a little bit, but very stable, very controlled. Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, all less than 3%, and all year-on-year growths, very manageable. Next slide, please. Yeah, and kind of the same thing here for unemployment rates. Again, just this chart is kind of busy, but just you want to compare, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland on the left side to the USA, China, and Germany on the right side, and you can see they're all in line. Unemployment rates in Poland, a little bit higher. These again, people have sometimes some concern about availability of labor. Well, again, all we're trying to show and demonstrate here is these four countries unemployment rates and labor rates are on par with USA, China, and Germany. Next slide, please. Sure. Again, kind of a little idea here. We just picked two regions. When you look at these countries, you just can't look at a national unemployment number. It's really misleading. So on the left side, Czech Republic, the most area, which we know very well, there's 27,000 available workers there right now. The Eastern Silesian region of Czech Republic on the right side, it's got over 50,000 available workers. But if you could look at other areas and pick and go over to on the far west side, and and have much more difficult employment issues. So you have to really understand the specifics of the regions and where you put your facilities. Likewise, on the right side of the chart, where Poland, you can see the Katowice area up north. I should say the Kwadep area up north. You have a 9.1 unemployment rate, but if you get down south, you could be as low as 3.3. So those are the areas you kind of want to stay away from. On the far eastern parts of Poland, you can see unemployment rates are 8-9%. What that tells you, in of course Slovakia and those areas, that there's available labor. You just have to be sure you know where you're going, understand your labor rates specifically by region, not by country. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Mark, I one question that's popped up, and just for everyone, recognize they can ask questions all throughout this, and you're available to. We'll answer the questions during the presentation. One question popped up is, can you do the same thing on within Slovakia and Hungary? Do they also have available labor in pockets like this, like Czech Republic and Poland?
Oh yeah, of course, of course. So like there's certain areas around the Budapest area you'd want to stay away from because it's dominated heavy by some of the German auto manufacturers, even some of the Korean auto manufacturers. So sure, no, you work hard with your partners on the ground and analyze the unemployment rates. And be very similar in the States to looking at unemployment rates, perhaps in Chicago area vis-a-vis down south of Chicago, down around St. Louis. So yeah, it's very regional, and yeah, and workers are very regional. Typically, they'll travel. Most of them in these four countries drive, even the blue collars, and they'll typically travel 30 to 45 minutes. So you have to do your concentric rings. How far will they come? What's the population of employment, etc. So yeah, it's a little bit of a science, but it's very doable. Uh,
Great,
next,
thanks.
next slide, please. Yeah.
There we go.
So yeah, and what's some of the areas in these countries you're looking for? I mean, and they all offer a lot of good things. Some maybe a little better than others, but They all offer the ability to, you can go there if you're looking to relocate a manufacturing facility. You can lease existing facilities. You can build them and build them yourself and lease them back. You can have someone else build them and lease them back. You can hire general contractors, architects and engineers. You can put 30-year mortgages on these properties to manage your cash flow while at the same time still owning a facility. Corporate tax rates in general, of course, rebates, I should say, are very attractive. In some cases, up to 50% of your total capital investment. For example, if you've invested, say, $50 million, you can get 50% of that back, $25 million, and they'd spread that over 10 to 12 years as a rebate against your annual tax liabilities. Quite often they'll give you a holiday of 2 to 3 years before they start the clock, because that's typically when you're ramping up and you're really not really making any money. And then your years 2 through 12, when you are making money, if you have $20-30 million of tax abatements, you might be able to get anywhere from $1 to $2 to $3 million a year of tax credits. Again, training subsidies, sure. If you put a lot of them, all of them actually, if you put in training centers, you help educate the employees in the area, you'll get grants, training costs, and in some cases, depending on where you go, you might even get additional tax holidays on property. So they're all very aggressive in attracting new foreign investment. Next slide, please. Yeah, and again, kind of a comparison chart. Everyone, we all worry about, of course, global corruption, transparency, et cetera, and as you can see, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, all in that kind of France, Germany, USA. USA, of course, is the most transparent and least corrupt. But these countries we're talking about, the four, are very comparable to other advanced countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, and again, just kind of export destinations. What they says is there's two things. There's good trade from all four countries back to Western Europe. In the case of all four of these, Germany is their number one export markets. In addition, though, you'll see there's good trade within. Poland shipping to Czech Republic, Slovakia shipping to Poland, Hungary shipping to Romania. So you can see very good domestic markets within the Weisgard, and of course without, meaning in this case Germany. Very, very good markets. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's really good the V4 has to offer? Well, it's labor, got availability of labor, skilled labor, low cost labor, and a strong pool of technical talent. Supply chain. There's 30 years now they've been developing, as I was mentioned earlier, around the auto industry, the auto support industry, the manufacturing industry, the components, the appliances. So a very sophisticated logistics network for supply chain, which is you could be producing in Poland and having suppliers 20 miles across the border coming from Czech Republic. So really good. And then of course ease of doing business, transparency is quite good. They want you to be there. Good, strong cross-border trade. So really, these four countries have a lot to offer if you have a large part of your business in Central, or more importantly, in Europe, and that's where you're trying to supply from. Next slide, please. So yeah, as we said, the V4 offers cost savings potential for companies currently supplying, companies from all over the world. This is a great place to be. Next slide.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. Now I want to turn this over to Dan. Dan's going to be able to give some comparisons of manufacturing in these four countries as compared to China and the USA.
This is Alex Brown. Let me step in real quick. I understand that we've had some people were not able to hear at the very beginning. There were about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes where people could not hear. So I just wanted to make sure everyone's clear. And I'm sorry you missed that. We've gotten this problem corrected. We are going through right now. We've broken this presentation down into 4 areas. The first was an overview of the Visegrad for the 4 countries that we talked about: Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Czech Republic. We first gave an overview, what you just heard. We are now breaking it down into 4 sectors. This presentation, first was the overview. Second was we're now going to do cost comparisons for supplying customers in Europe from China, from the US, from Western Europe, and compare that with the Visegrad 4 countries. We're then going to be going through how you actually do that. Some companies are looking at these 4 countries, the Visegrad 4, simply to source product from that region. They're looking at China and the US. Costs are getting more expensive. Some companies are looking at it from a manufacturing point of view, from their global manufacturing. So we're going to hit it from both the supply chain side and the manufacturing. And then we've got 2 case studies at the end of US companies who have either set up supply chains there or US companies who have set up manufacturing there. So thank you very much, Dan. I'll turn it over to you. You will take then the cost comparisons of supplying you customers in Europe.
Okay. Thanks, Alex. Why don't you go to the next slide? Okay. Well, over the next few slides, I'll talk about some high-level cost analysis comparisons between manufacturing and sourcing out of Central Europe versus the US versus China, and even versus Western Europe. When we look at this, we've grouped the V4 countries together. Although there are differences in costs structure between the countries, they're relatively small in comparison when you compare the different regions of the world. And on the cost savings potential, we've gotten this from a variety of sources, some from the larger consultancies, but also we've done some work and we've got our own data that we've collected from the work we've done as comparison, and they line up fairly well with what the consultancies are telling us. Next slide, please. Okay, when you look at Central Europe versus China versus supplying Europe, Western Europe from China, certainly you've got a huge freight cost savings potential. As Mark went into some detail, these markets are, these locations are very close to Western European markets. They've got good highways, they've got good distribution network. So really substantial savings on freight and distribution potential, upwards of 60%. That implies lower inventory costs, lower inventory because you don't have to inventory that product that's on the water, but also your response to changes in demand are much faster. So you've got less safety stock involved, and so we're seeing inventory reductions of 40% or so from clients we talk to. Corporate tax savings. China tax rates are relatively higher than what you see in Central Europe. And just as importantly, the tax incentives that were available, income tax incentives that were available in China 10 years ago, rapidly going away. Either companies have exhausted those options because they've been established so long, but in most cases, there's just not those incentives to invest in manufacturing in China like they used to be, especially if you're for an export market. And then certainly import duty. You've got a combined EU market, so you're not paying import duties into bringing into the market from China. You're supplying within that market. So these savings greatly far outweigh the slightly lower labor costs in China. And additionally, what you're seeing is labor costs in the coastal regions of China, Shanghai, Guangdong, Beijing region, have escalated up such that there's not very much difference between those labor costs in those markets, particularly for professional and technical help, as you would find in Central Europe. Next slide.
Dan, we had a quick question. Someone said, just want to confirm, this slide means that if you are producing the product, this is comparing either production of product in China and then exporting that to Western Europe versus this, producing this in Central Eastern Europe in the Visegrad 4 countries and supplying Western Europe. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. That was China, and now here's the U.S.
Similar analysis versus the U.S. in some cases, similar numbers. Freight cost savings, as we mentioned, you've got close proximity to your Western European markets. You don't have the ocean freight and then on inventory, you don't have the additional inventory associated with having product on the water in transit to your market in Europe. And also, you've shortened your supply time, and improved your responsiveness. So generally your amount of safety stock that you're holding to compensate for that uncertainty and long supply chain is reduced. So you significant reduction in inventory costs. You see that as a one-time benefit in terms of one-time cash benefit, reducing your inventory, but also an ongoing reduction in your cost of capital or your working capital. Corporate tax savings, even with the changes in U.S. Corporate tax rates, Central Europe is measurably lower than the U.S. In some cases, raw materials, particularly in the case of steel and aluminum, you've got reasonable savings by relocating to Central Europe, and depending on your industry, and this could be a very significant driver. And a couple of clients that we've worked with have seen a major savings in raw materials by relocating some of their production from the U.S. to Central Europe. Skilled labor cost, about half the cost for your operators, your labor force, and also your management and technical staff. So across the board, substantial savings. And then similar to the case where you'd be supplying from China, you've got a import duty savings potential, being with one common market and one common EU supply base. So.
Dan had a question come in about the skilled labor. First question was, says the company, we are in the metal subcontracting business. Apparently they are like a die caster bending metal. They said the question was, one, how available is skilled labor in the Visegrad 4 countries? And how available is it? And then on the skilled labor potential, how do you, the 49% is the assumption there that the cost of the skilled labor in the Visegrad 4 countries, these 4 regions, these 4 countries, is 51 or 50% of what it is in the U.S.?
On the labor cost, then yes, labor cost is about half what it is in the U.S. And whether that's for factory labor or technical engineering professional staff, it's right around half the cost. As far as, if you're in the metal fabricating business, it's well established throughout the regions. Mark mentioned earlier, the auto industry is very well established, but also other industries, appliance industries, for example, cookware industry, general manufacturing, metal bending is well established in the pockets of that in each of the 4 countries in the region.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right. So the next question is, if your customers are in Western Europe, why not set up a manufacturing or supply point for them out of the West? Next slide, Alice. A similar story. Although you don't have logistic savings associated that you see from the U.S. or China versus China, you do have corporate tax cost savings potential that are fairly substantial. Skilled labor costs, roughly the same between Western Europe and the U.S., so you see similar labor savings. And then in the case of you're building a facility, if you're going to want to go and set up a manufacturing facility, the cost to build in Central Europe is substantially less than it is in Western Europe. So you can get up and running in business at substantially lower cost. And you can do that without sacrificing speed, and access to your market in the West. Next slide, Alex. Okay, so transitioning, so just in summary, the significant cost savings potential versus China versus supply from the US versus supply from Western Europe. You're operating within a single market, so the duty barriers aren't there. You're close to your customer base. Response time is faster and reducing lead times and reducing your inventories. Next slide, Alex.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about how do you understand the advantages, how do you understand the savings, understand the opportunities, and how do you apply that to moving your supply to Central Europe. And this could be whether you move your manufacturing there or whether you decide to source from Central Europe. Next slide, Alex.
Sure.
All right. So East-West helps clients whether they're looking at relocating or expanding their manufacturing globally, or whether they're looking to expand their supply base. Each situation is unique to the clients, and we go through a process where we evaluate whether a manufacturing move or a sourcing move might be more appropriate for the client. Next slide, please, Alex. All right. So the first step is to understand the current state, and that could be, and that would include understanding your location, your operations, your customers, your current suppliers, where your competitors are. Understand your cost, a deep dive into your cost, not just your product cost, but your cost of logistics and delivery, the amount of inventory you carry, the cost to carry that inventory, looking at your key raw materials and their cost and pricing trends with that. And finally, the production efficiency. And this could be, it could be your delivery, on-time delivery performance, your manufacturing efficiency, and also very importantly, looking at your capacity constraints. Are you likely to need to expand your capacity in the near future to continue to supply your customers? Okay, and depending on the results of that analysis, we go two different ways, two very different ways. One may be along a manufacturing expansion, and that could be a new facility or a consolidation of facilities or a relocation of assets, which is a very different analysis than a supply chain optimization, where you're really looking at opportunities to expand your supplier base or possibly enter into a contract manufacturing arrangement. Next slide, Alex.
Sure.
I'm not seeing the next slide.
Excuse me. Dan, can you see that?
Oh, yep, I get now. Okay. Yeah, so the next phase would be to develop a strategy, and it depends on the results of the analysis on the first step. For a global relocation, we would manufacturing location. We would focus on identifying four member countries and regions within those countries that would meet the individual companies' needs. Next, Alex.
So that would apply to both. The question popped up. This location is going to apply to whether you're putting in a plant relocation or whether you're identifying new suppliers. The process will be different for those. Is that correct?
The process would be different. In the case of a plant relocation, the focus would be on government investment incentives, taxation, availability of labor, both skilled and technical professional labor. and presence of a logistic network to be able to supply your customer base. In the event of a supplier footprint expansion or contract manufacturing, you'd be looking at an industrial, a general industrial base or manufacturing ecosystem that could support the type of work you're trying to do. And but also you'd be looking at the general cost position in that area. And East West conducts that research. We do desktop research, we do external research, but we also have, and most importantly, we have local staff on the ground in Europe that have a long history and experience, both setting up manufacturing facilities and qualifying suppliers and contract manufacturers in Central Europe. Next slide, please.
Thank you.
And in the selection process, phase 3, again, 2 different sets of criteria. If you're looking at a manufacturing site, it's a lot of face-to-face work, direct meeting with industrial zones, understand the support from the zone, from the tax bureau, any environmental concerns, support, what the investment incentives are, and so get a good understanding of that landscape and the site, and then move on to interviewing and qualifying construction partners, and these might be companies, engineering firms, project management companies that would work with you through the course of your construction implementation. And since you're setting up a new company and a new facility, you need service providers, legal, accounting, HR, recruiting, and we get involved in identifying and screening those as well. Finally, when we've got all the pieces, we put together an appropriate project financial analysis to present to the client to quantify the opportunity. In the case of a supplier, we go through a process where we're doing research to find potential suppliers, and then conduct interviews with them and to develop a short list. From there, we go through an more intensive interview, questionnaires on their capability to understand their technical capability, their financial status, and particularly important, their capacity or their capability to take on new business. And from there, when the most likely candidates, we get preliminary quotes and in some cases samples, and which we would use to develop the final cost analysis and recommendations to the client. Next slide, please, Alex.
Dan, a question came up around the supplier selection. The question was, company here, it's in the consumer business. It says it's currently producing products in Mexico and some in China. I think it's China and Asia Pacific. Their question was, when we've done this supplier work in the past, how does it normally, have we found that the Visegrad 4 countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, have we found that we've been able to find generally good suppliers for metal bending products in those 4 regions? In other words, have those 4 regions been able to find some good suppliers? Or have we had any situation where people are looking for a supply chain base and they've not found it in those countries?
Particularly in that industry, it's very strong, and we've had very good success finding capable suppliers for metal bending, aluminum casting, and associated with components, even plastic injection molding, which would support that. So we've had good success in the region.
I should have read it in the question that the company talked about being a supplier in the automotive sector, but they're a tier 3 supplier, so they're looking at, they're still on the metal bending side, so that's what they were looking at. All right, great, thank you.
And finally, the last last phase is the hands-on piece of this, the implementation piece. And in the case of plant construction, go through a process to select your partners, architects, engineers, general contractors, go through a formalized and transparent bidding and procurement process for these sources, oversee the design, detail, and engineering to comply with local building codes. So you want to do this, most of this design on the ground in Central Europe. Ensure that permits and licenses are obtained throughout the design and construction. There'll be several checkpoints as you go through, and coordinate the building of the facility, installation of equipment, and commissioning equipment. And as we go through this, HR and administration becomes a significant aspect of this. You identify and recruit your senior professional staff, technical staff relatively early in the process, and continue on through selection of production personnel as necessary. Generally working with HR service providers, could be local, it could be international firms, depending on the particular geography. In a supply chain implementation, it's a different set. Again, we've developed detailed requests for quotes to send out, get those formal quotations, and then work with the client to determine a final recommendation, whether it's to source components or perhaps go to a total contract manufacturer. Once you've made that decision, you need to develop a transition plan to get the client from where he is now to a new source. And it's usually multiple months of activity to transition to the new supplier. And once that's in place, make sure there's appropriate continuous improvement processes with the supplier, looking at their startup productivity, their startup quality, and looking at going forward, what would be appropriate gains to be made over time to improve those, to be, and ideally to be able to share with the client. Okay, next slide.
So yeah, this is.
So now this is Alex. Now we're moving into case studies. We've got 2 case studies. The first one's around establishing the global manufacturing footprint on the ground in Central Eastern Europe and these 4 countries. And then the second case study will be focused on the supply chain, establishing supply chain. The first one was a manufacturing case study that was completed about 6 years ago. And then we've recently, they're recently looking at another manufacturing operation in Eastern Europe. And then the supply chain was a very recent case study. So I'll turn the first one over to Mark. Mark, if you'll take this first case study.
Yeah, sure. Next slide, please. Sure. So the background, this was a large USA manufacturer, well-known brand, frankly number one in the industry, number 1 market share. Like a lot of companies in the early 2000s, they wanted to reduce costs, so they moved. They moved about 40% of their product. They moved a large part of their production to China, and achieved about a 40% cost reduction. Things went really well. Business grew really strong in Europe, and now 15 years later, the European business is 35% of their total multi-billion-dollar business. So at that time, the European market right now is being supplied from both USA and China, and this has created some challenges. As we all know, the cost advantages of China have decreased with escalating labor, energy, raw materials costs, all that sort of stuff. Logistics costs have also risen out of China because all the ports and the containers are full. Inventories were excessive. Now what's happened is, of course, there's so much time on the water to go from, say, China in this case to Europe is causing a problem. And key raw materials, this is the USA piece, and this is really kind of the tariff piece that's affecting steel and that sort of things that go into the product. So here you got this company now who 20 years ago, a decision to really move a lot of manufacturing to China. 20 years later, it's really flipped on them. Their tax rebates have gone away. Their good labor has gone away. the transparency of how to do business in China has really become muddied, et cetera, et cetera. So now they asked East West to to do a study for them, a cost analysis, and see what would make sense if they move that facility from China to Eastern Europe to supply that 35% or which is about $500 or $600 million of business. So we were engaged to do a kind of, well, first was a country study, and then a region study, and then eventually down to a physical location, and then build the building and help manage the construction and the initial manpower requirements. Next slide, please. So first thing we had to do, again, like Dan was saying on his piece a little earlier, you have to assess what's going on. You had to evaluate the cost, the fees, the assumptions around locating production to the Central European. You got to work with a client really early on to understand, their manufacturing processes, their core competencies, what they have to have internally, what they could perhaps outsource. Is welding, painting, enameling, is that a core competency, or is that something they may want to outsource? So then once you get a good idea on what they want to do, then it also tells you what they don't want to do, and so you begin to look at suppliers that could support both what they're doing and what they want to purchase from outside. Then of course you have to take that information and develop a location strategy. And then what we typically do, we always do actually with the client, is we develop a scorecard, a matrix. Now there's a lot of stuff on there, but it's you can imagine on there, there's labor, there's taxes, there's government incentives, there's logistics, there's supply base, there's legal, there's transparency. It's a whole issue, a variety of things, and you weight them. What's important? If in the case of this client, having available, strong local labor for both skilled and unskilled was critical. So we had to be sure we were locating in a place where the unemployment was not too difficult, where the technical schools were there, where the other manufacturers who have developed a good labor base were there. And then of course, big thing for this client was speed to market. So anyway, we did a lot of this work through our staff, through desktop, through face-to-face, working with agencies, government agencies, property developers, HR providers, et cetera, and our recommendation was we ought to go to Southern Poland, because why? The labor was great, the suppliers were good, the investment incentives were very, very attractive. So our recommendation on phase 2 under strategy or location was Southern Poland. Next slide, please.
Sure, Mark, there was a question that popped up. The question was, are we going to cover in here for this client? As you mentioned, they had a manufacturing in China. Mm-hmm. And when we had when we get in this case study, when we get involved in discussing that transition and then the closure we had to do with that plant. And the response is, no, we're not going to cover that. We talked to us offline about the actual closure of the facility, but we will get into the relocation here of what we did in Poland, but not the closure of the China plant.
Right. No, but on that note, that's a very serious topic, because if you've been manufacturing there for years and years, you've had a lot of suppliers, and then all of a sudden you quit using them, you may have created a competitor. So, but again, that's for a different time. Yeah, so selection process. So, then now we're in Poland, and then we visited and evaluated 13 sites. We shortlisted 6 sites for negotiation. The factory we were wanting to build was 400,000 square feet, 300 people. That's about 15, 16 hectares, 50, 60 acres. We had to have labor nearby. We had to have technical skills nearby. We interviewed and evaluated engineering design firms and general contractors, property developers, recruiters, staffing people. We initiated with this client. They wanted us to really manage the whole thing, from acquisition of the property to finding and working with the architects and engineers, to bidding out to the general contractors, to then managing the construction of the project, Yeah, and then based on that, they decided. Well, at first they wanted to look at a lease, and then they wanted to then help them build it, design it for they wanted to, and then perhaps lease it back. Uh, we also helped negotiate with the government agencies to getting them 35% tax incentives on their capital investment, which includes land, building, and of course production equipment over a 10-year period. And we also went to work closely to help them set up their entities, their business licenses, their building permits, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also help them again with just working with their senior management to accept with the Board of Investment. Next slide, please. So for the final hands-on implementation, we again, as I said earlier, we coordinated with all the people that build engineering, construction, GCs. We had our owners represented on the ground to oversee the general contractors as well as the project management firm as well as the architects and engineers. We identified component suppliers that qualified them to establish the supply chain for the new factory. We got a HR partner to help us with the recruitment of their senior management. We got their MDs and finance and HR people on very, very early in the process. We then coordinated and worked with equipment installation and commissioning, and then we made sure we had all the sign-offs and the approvals and the occupancy permits to begin production. Next slide, please.
And Mark, question that popped up:
Yeah.
How long did it take to get that facility up and running?
Well, there was about 6 months of all we call the pre-work, the negotiating, the land, the tax incentives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then 12 months to build and install the equipment in the factory. So about 18 months total from an idea to production.
Okay.
Yeah, so extremely successful project. We had over $3 million in logistics cost savings because now we're producing closer. We're not shipping stuff halfway around the world, and and then our inventories went down based on the fact that we don't have to store as much because it's not on the water for 8 weeks. Labor savings because more so from the stuff that production from the USA, where the labor rates are about half of the USA, a little bit on par, a little higher than China, but half of the USA. Material savings again because we're there locally. We're not having any duty issues. We're buying local. There's no duties applied to a lot of the componentry, and then of course tax savings. 35% on total investment of about $50 million. Amortized over a 10-year period, so that's $25 million. So that's roughly about $2 million a year of tax savings off their tax bill for the first 10 years of production. You usually we negotiate a 2-year holiday, so the clock didn't start until the start of the 3rd year, because typically the first 2 years you're not really in the profitable phase anyway, so there's no savings on tax because your profits are quite low. And then other benefits, yeah, obviously I mentioned inventory greatly improved, and then of course the sales and marketing people, distribution we're very happy because now they're 8 hours away from their market, not 15 days. So anyway, very successful project. I think Dan's got another one now he's going to talk about.
Yep.
Great, thanks, Mark.
Yeah. The next case study is the supply chain expansion, the supplier expansion. The background on this was a U.S.-based manufacturer of consumer appliances with operations in the U.S. and China. And the client was supplying Europe from either U.S. or China, depending on the product line. And the product was, once into Europe, it was inventoried in a series of distribution centers in Western Europe, closer to the market, where they held inventory, often, multiple layers of inventory. So they were seeing long lead times and excessive logistics costs. So they were that was both reducing their margins and causing difficulty responding to changes in the marketplace. Additionally, they had good growth in Europe over the years, and that growth had absorbed the available production capacity. So they were faced with, in the not too distant future, decision on expansion. We need to expand to continue to be able to supply the demand. So their decision up front, their preliminary decision, was to evaluate some outsourcing of production. They weren't quite ready to make the step of a new manufacturing site. They wanted to look at outsourcing. So next slide, please, Alex.
Sure.
So the first step is, again, to thoroughly understand the background, the specific project objectives, working with the client to understand the cost, in particularly the cost and process breakdown of their product, both their materials and logistics costs. Any concerns about or any specific quality related concerns? Are there any difficulty meeting certain quality requirements of their product? Any IP issues or worries about IP? Then again, look at volume requirements and growth plans, so we'd be able to have better conversations with potential suppliers around the potential for growth and potential for their volume. And finally, is to develop a strong working relationship with the client, because this is going to be a long project, and so we need to have those relationships in place. Next step, Alex.
All right.
All right. So we worked with the client to do analysis and identify products that might be the best fit for outsourcing. And as we got into data, one product line, was nearly half of the units sold in Europe. So that seemed to be a potential, a good potential there. And as it was, about 90% of the components for that product were currently being outsourced from other suppliers. And so they already had some history and experience getting those parts procured on the outside. So that was a positive. We did a high level evaluation of product cost and trying to understand what might be most applicable to sourcing in Europe, but also where to assemble the product. And this comes into focus on Central Europe, where assembly packaging is a relatively labor intensive process, so that we were drawn to Central Europe for that labor efficiency. And then finally developed a final strategy. We determined that about 80% of the component spend could be supplied from CEE. The balance would be from other Europe, and some smaller percentage supplied from the US or Asia, but primarily could be from Central Europe, primarily because they had a strong supplier base in aluminum casting for stamping, metalworking, coating, and injection molding. And then we would do the assembly in Central Europe to take advantage of the lower labor costs there, but also the excellent logistics connectivity to Western Europe. As we've talked about many times, you don't lose very much in response time by locating in Central Europe versus the West.
And Dan, I think
a
question popped up, which about is DCs. You're talking about distribution centers. I think in this case, this company had, I think, three distribution centers already in Europe that they were supplying mostly from the US.
Yes, they had several distribution centers in Europe, actually, yes.
Okay.
So then we went through to identify potential suppliers, and through desktop research, through our, as I mentioned earlier, we've got staff, East West has staff on the ground that's got a long history of supplier development, and doing contract manufacturing projects in Europe. Develop a supplier qualification template questionnaires to understand the supplier's capability, both from a technical standpoint, but financial standpoint, and also ability to take on additional production. And then with the short list of suppliers, we worked them to develop projected unit costs, looked at their quality control plans, and then talked about productivity, improved productivity commitments that those savings would be able to share with the client going forward. Next slide.
There we go. On the last step was on step 4.
Okay. So the final was the final negotiation with suppliers' recommendation to the client. We negotiated manufacturing cost payment terms, and as again productivity improvements going forward. Understand what sort of inventory holding they would be providing, so we could move some of that inventory back upstream. And then worked out lead time forecasting requirements, general ability to meet demand, and then developed an analysis that we presented to the client. Next slide, Alex.
Dan, one question came in around are there warranties? I guess it's all the vulnerability of warranty failure policies. The question was, how do the warranty policies for Eastern Europe compare with a typical supplier from China? Is it very similar? This person's in the
is generally better because you're in a position to, because of your proximity between the customers and the supplier, you're in a better position to enforce a warranty or due to the long lead times. It's more difficult working with Chinese suppliers.
All right, great, thank you.
All right, I'm waiting for the. Okay, so the result of this was we did outsource that line to Central Europe. The components were sourced primarily from Southern Poland and Eastern Czech Republic, and we got landed cost savings, raw materials and freight cost savings versus supply from the U.S., and we reduced the lead times and inventories currently. What we did is we set up an assembly and packaging operation working with a 3PL firm that the client had done some business in Western Europe. This is a fairly well-developed model in Central Europe, Western Central Europe, where the 3PLs can do final assembly and packaging on behalf of a client. So they've got that in place, and that allowed us, with that proximity to Western Europe, that allowed us to eliminate 2 distribution centers in Western Europe, further reducing their costs. The cost reduction achieved was about 12%, which is $13 million a year versus supplying from Europe. And as going forward, looking at potential additional reductions as volumes increase. Inventories were reduced by approximately 30% versus what they were seeing when they were being supplied from the U.S. And the response to demand changes were greatly improved, as we've talked about several times. We can respond much more quickly to changes in demand in the marketplace by being close to it. That's about it.
All right, excellent. Dan, thank you. Just to recap, we covered for here on the webinar, we covered both an overview of the Visegrad 4, which are the 4 countries: Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary. Then we reviewed the cost comparisons of manufacturing in Central Eastern Europe compared to China, the U.S. And then we walked through actually how we do it, whether we're sourcing product, identifying new suppliers in Central Eastern Europe, or establishing manufacturing plants, which we've done in Central Eastern Europe. And then finally, the 2 case studies. So as you review the information. We'll be forwarding out to everyone a copy of this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us, and we can answer any questions directly with you by phone call or in person. Thank you very much, and this concludes this webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.